Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the gate before I call security because there's no way in hell you can afford that seat. Those words would destroy Robert Hayes's career in exactly 47 minutes, but he didn't know that yet. What he also didn't know was that he was speaking to the woman who literally owned the aircraft parked outside Gate 67A, the woman whose engineering genius had revolutionized the very engines that would soon carry him toward unemployment and public humiliation. But let's start from the beginning, because every fall from grace has its origin story, and Bob Hayes's story began 18 years earlier, when he first put on that crisp LAX uniform and decided he was the guardian of aviation order. The fluorescent lights of LAX Terminal 6 hummed their familiar tune of barely contained chaos, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional anxiety that only airports manage to achieve. It was a Tuesday evening in October, the kind of night when the Pacific Ocean breeze should have been cooling Los Angeles, but instead the Santa Ana winds were pushing hot air through the terminal like nature's own hairdryer, making everyone just a little bit more irritable than usual. Standing behind the podium at Gate 67A was Robert Hayes, though everyone called him Bob, a man who wore his 47 years like a badge of experience and his 18 years of airline service like a shield against any passenger who dared question his authority. His uniform was pressed to military precision, his name tag polished to a mirror shine, and his expression carried the permanent scowl of someone who had seen every possible passenger scam lie and manipulation tactic that desperate travelers could devise. Bob wasn't just a gate agent in his own mind. He was the last line of defense against chaos. The thin blue polyester line that stood between orderly aviation procedures and complete anarchy at 35,000 feet. He had opinions about everything from carry-on bag sizes to passenger attire, and he wasn't shy about sharing those opinions with anyone who would listen, which mostly meant his colleague Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old agent who worked the adjacent gate and had learned to nod politely while mentally planning her escape from these conversations. The truth was that Bob Hayes was scared, though he would never admit it, not even to himself, during those 3 a.m. moments when sleep wouldn't come and the bills piled up on his kitchen table seemed to grow taller in the darkness. His divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, a messy affair that cost him half his savings and most of his confidence, and his ex-wife Jennifer had made it clear that his obsession with airline regulations and his need to be right about everything had driven her away, just as surely as his inability to see past his own insecurities. The mortgage on his Torrance condo was 3 months behind the credit card bills were mounting. And at 47 years old, Bob Hayes felt the cold breath of obsolescence on his neck every time he saw younger agents being hired, agents who seemed to navigate the digital boarding systems with an ease that made him feel ancient and disposable. He had lost his previous airline job during the 2008 recession, a trauma that left him paranoid about rule enforcement and desperate to prove his value to his current employer by being the most vigilant gate agent in the terminal. But paranoia, as Bob would soon learn, has a way of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, and his desperate need to find problems where none existed was about to create the biggest problem of his professional life. Flight 892 to Tokyo was already delayed by 30 minutes due to a maintenance issue with the auxiliary power unit, and the 243 passengers booked on the flight were displaying that particular brand of controlled agitation that comes from disrupted travel plans, and the knowledge that their carefully planned schedules were being upended by forces beyond their control. Bob had already had confrontations with 2 passengers earlier in his shift, a businessman who tried to board early with a fake priority pass and a family who seemed to think that having 3 small children entitled them to special boarding privileges. These victories had filled Bob with a sense of righteousness and purpose, the feeling that he was earning his paycheck by protecting the airline from passengers who thought the rules didn't apply to them. And as he surveyed the gate area with his practiced eye, he was already looking for the next problem to solve, the next passenger to put in their place. He had no idea that problem was about to walk up to his podium wearing jeans and sneakers, carrying herself with a quiet confidence that he would mistake for entitlement, and that she would turn his entire understanding of power and authority upside down in less than an hour. Dr. Amelia Chen approached Gate 67A with the fluid grace of someone who had walked through airports in 43 countries and understood that travel was as much about patience as it was about destinations. At 38 years old, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from building a multi-billion-dollar aerospace company from scratch. But nothing about her appearance would have suggested to a casual observer that she was one of the most powerful people in commercial aviation. She wore dark blue jeans that fit her perfectly but bore no designer labels, white leather sneakers that were clearly expensive but understated, and a navy blazer that managed to look both casual and professional without trying too hard to be either. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a worn leather messenger bag that had belonged to her father, an aeronautical engineer who had died when she was 22 and whose passion for flight had shaped every decision she had made since. The bag was scuffed and weathered, bearing the scratches and stains of 1,000 business trips, but Amelia wouldn't have traded it for any designer purse because it connected her to the man who had taught her that engineering was about solving problems, not about appearances, and that the best solutions were often the ones that looked effortless even when they required extraordinary effort to achieve. She had been in her office in Seattle just 6 hours earlier, reviewing quarterly reports and planning the next phase of her company's expansion into sustainable aviation fuels, when her phone rang with the call that would bring her to LAX. Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the most experienced pilots in the airline's fleet, had been experiencing intermittent sensor readings from the left engine of aircraft N2847AC, the plane that would soon become the center of Bob Hayes's professional downfall. The readings were subtle, the kind of thing that might be dismissed as instrument error by less experienced mechanics, but Captain Walsh had been flying Chen Aerospace aircraft for 8 years, and she knew when something wasn't right. The sensors were reporting fuel flow inconsistencies during high-altitude cruise, tiny variations that could indicate anything from a faulty sensor to a developing engine problem that could ground the aircraft for weeks and cost the airline millions in lost revenue. Amelia could have authorized the mechanics to replace the entire sensor array, a procedure that would have taken 3 days and cost $200,000. But she suspected the problem was in the software calibration rather than the hardware itself. The only way to confirm her theory was to monitor the engine data in real time during flight, which meant she needed to be on the aircraft when it took off, and the only available seat on the sold-out flight to Tokyo was 2A in first class. She had purchased the ticket with her corporate American Express card exactly 47 minutes before arriving at the gate, a last-minute booking that would have raised red flags in any airline's fraud detection software if the name on the card hadn't been cross-referenced with the aircraft ownership records and immediately flagged as VIP priority. But Bob Hayes, as Amelia would soon discover, was not in the habit of checking passenger records before making assumptions about who belonged in first class and who didn't. As she joined the priority boarding line, Amelia was thinking about engine thermodynamics and sensor calibration protocols, not about the middle-aged gate agent who was already studying her with the suspicious gaze of someone who had decided that her casual attire and unremarkable luggage meant she was trying to scam her way into premium seating. She was mentally reviewing the diagnostic procedures she would need to run once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, calculating the data points she would need to isolate the sensor malfunction and develop a software patch that could be implemented remotely. She had no way of knowing that Bob Hayes was looking at her and seeing everything he thought was wrong with modern air travel passengers who thought they could dress however they wanted, who believed their casual attitude toward airline dress codes entitled them to the same treatment as the business travelers who understood the importance of proper attire and professional presentation. The line moved slowly, as it always did, with each passenger presenting their boarding pass to be scanned and then walking down the jetway toward their assigned seats. Amelia waited patiently, checking her phone for updates from her engineering team in Seattle and responding to a text message from Captain Walsh, confirming that the pre-flight checks were complete and they were ready to begin boarding as soon as the gate agent released the passengers. She had no idea that the gate agent was about to make the biggest mistake of his career, or that in less than an hour video of their confrontation would be viewed by millions of people around the world, becoming a case study in workplace bias and the dangerous assumptions people make when they judge others based on appearance rather than character. When Amelia reached the front of the line, she pulled out her phone and opened the airline's mobile app displaying the bright blue and white boarding pass that clearly showed her name, seat assignment 2A, and the first-class designation that Bob Hayes was about to question, with the kind of aggressive skepticism that would soon make him famous for all the wrong reasons. Bob looked up from his computer screen with the practiced expression of someone who was used to catching passengers trying to board with invalid tickets, expired passes, or seats they hadn't actually purchased. And his first impression of Amelia was exactly what she had expected: skepticism mixed with condescension, and seasoned with the kind of casual prejudice that he probably didn't even recognize in himself. "Excuse me," Miss Bob said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. "This is the priority boarding line for first-class passengers and elite status members only. General boarding for economy passengers will begin in about 15 minutes, and you'll want to join that line over there near the windows where the signs clearly indicate the appropriate boarding zones for each ticket type." Amelia looked at him calmly, her expression showing neither surprise nor irritation, because she had been in this situation before and she understood that the best response to assumption was simple fact. "I have a first-class ticket," she said, holding up her phone so he could see the boarding pass display. "Seat 2A. Would you like to scan it?" Bob glanced at the phone screen with the dismissive look of someone who was absolutely certain he was right and wasn't particularly interested in evidence to the contrary. He had seen every kind of boarding pass fraud in his 18 years behind the podium, from sophisticated digital forgeries to simple screenshots of other people's tickets, and he was confident in his ability to spot a scammer from 50 feet away. "Ma'am, I can tell from here that's not going to scan properly," he said, not even reaching for the scanner that would have immediately confirmed that her ticket was not only valid, but was associated with a passenger record flagged for VYP treatment. First-class passengers don't generally show up wearing sneakers and carrying backpacks that look like they came from a college bookstore, and I've learned to trust my instincts about these things over the years. The passengers behind Amelia in line were starting to shift restlessly, checking their watches and muttering to each other about the delay, but she remained perfectly still and perfectly calm the way her father had taught her to be when facing skepticism about her qualifications or capabilities. "My sneakers cost more than most people's dress shoes," she said quietly. "My bag belonged to my father, who was an aeronautical engineer, and my ticket is completely valid. Please scan it." Bob's face flushed slightly red, the color that came when his authority was challenged by someone who should have been apologizing and moving to the back of the line rather than arguing with him. He had dealt with entitled passengers before, people who thought their attitude could overcome airline policies and procedures, and he was not about to let this particular woman think she could intimidate him into breaking the rules he had sworn to uphold. "I'm not scanning anything until I see proper identification and confirmation that you actually paid for that seat," he said, his voice rising just enough that the passengers behind Amelia could hear every word. "Last-minute first-class tickets cost upward of $8,000, and I've got serious doubts about whether you have that kind of money based on your appearance and demeanor, so we're going to verify your identity and payment method before you get anywhere near that aircraft." The businessman standing behind Amelia, a man in his 50s wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Bob's monthly salary, cleared his throat and spoke up with the kind of impatience that came from missing connecting flights and disrupted business meetings. "Agent Hayes," he said, reading Bob's name tag, her ticket. Obviously scanned green, or she wouldn't be in this line. Can we please move this along? Some of us have meetings to attend in Tokyo, but Bob Hayes was beyond reason at this point. His professional paranoia mixing with personal insecurity to create the kind of toxic cocktail that leads men to make career-ending decisions in full view of paying customers with smartphones and social media accounts. Sir, I appreciate your patience, but I need to verify this passenger's credentials before I can allow boarding to continue because fraud prevention is a critical component of aviation security, and I will not compromise the safety and integrity of this flight for the convenience of any individual passenger. Amelia reached into her messenger bag and pulled out her passport, a document that would have immediately resolved the situation if Bob had been interested in resolution rather than confrontation. Here's my identification, she said, extending the navy blue booklet toward him. Dr. Amelia Chen, United States citizen. And I'd like to point out that my boarding pass clearly indicates Seat 2A, which is a first-class assignment, and I have every right to board this aircraft with the ticket I purchased. Bob took the passport, but barely glanced at it because by this point he had committed to his course of action, and backing down would have meant admitting he was wrong, something his fragile ego couldn't tolerate in front of the growing crowd of passengers who were now openly staring at the confrontation unfolding at Gate 67A. Bob flipped through Amelia's passport with the theatrical skepticism of someone who is determined to find a problem, regardless of what the evidence showed. His fingers trembling slightly with the adrenaline that comes from public confrontation and the growing realization that he might be making a mistake he couldn't undo. Dr. Chen, he said, pronouncing her name with exaggerated skepticism. This passport appears to be legitimate, but that doesn't address my primary concern about the validity of your ticket and the method of payment used to purchase it. Last-minute first-class tickets are frequently purchased with stolen credit card information, and I have a responsibility to protect this airline from fraudulent transactions that could result in significant financial losses. Amelia felt the familiar weight of prejudice settling over the situation like fog rolling in from the Pacific Ocean, thick and suffocating and, unfortunately, predictable. She had dealt with variations of this conversation throughout her career, from venture capitalists who assumed she was someone's assistant to aircraft mechanics who directed their technical questions to the men standing next to her, and she had learned that the most effective response was usually patience, combined with unshakable confidence in her own qualifications. Mr. Hayes, she said, reading his name tag with the same careful pronunciation he had given her name. I purchased this ticket with my corporate American Express card approximately 1 hour ago because I need to be on this flight for business reasons that are both urgent and legitimate. If you scan my boarding pass, your system will show that my ticket is not only valid, but that my passenger record includes special instructions regarding my status as a VIP customer. But Bob was no longer listening to reason if he ever had been, because the crowd of passengers had grown larger and more restless, and he could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on him like a physical force. His colleague Sarah was watching from the adjacent gate, with wide eyes that seemed to be silently urging him to back down, but Bob interpreted her expression as support for his vigilant protection of airline policies and procedures. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify your ticket and payment information with our fraud prevention department. Bob announced, his voice now loud enough to be heard throughout the gate area. This type of last-minute high-value purchase often indicates identity theft or credit card fraud, and I cannot allow you to board until we confirm that you are the legitimate holder of the payment method used to complete this transaction. The murmur of conversation from the waiting passengers grew louder and more agitated, with several people pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a confrontation worthy of social media attention. Amelia noticed the cameras but didn't change her demeanor or her approach, because she had learned long ago that the best response to unreasonable behavior was reasonable behavior, even when every instinct told her to raise her voice and demand the respect she had earned through decades of professional achievement. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice remaining calm and level despite the rising tension, I strongly suggest you check the aircraft registration number before you continue down this path. Look out the window at the plane we're supposed to be boarding, check the registration painted on the tail, and then reconsider whether you really want to prevent me from getting on that aircraft." Bob glanced briefly toward the window where the Boeing 787 sat gleaming under the terminal lights, but he was too committed to his course of action to pay attention to details like registration numbers or the implications of what Amelia was trying to tell him. In his mind, she was a scammer who was trying to confuse him with technical aviation jargon, and he was the professional who would see through her deception and protect the airline from fraud. "I don't need to check anything except your identification and credit card," he declared, his voice carrying the ring of absolute certainty that would soon prove to be absolutely wrong. "Ma'am, I'm calling security right now, and you're going to remain in this gate area until we can verify that you didn't steal someone's credit card information to purchase a ticket you can't afford." The two LAX police officers who responded to Bob's call were both veterans of airport security men who had seen every possible variation of passenger disputes, and who approached Gate 67A with the weary professionalism of people who understood that most boarding conflicts were resolved more easily through calm conversation than through aggressive enforcement of airline policies that passengers often found confusing or arbitrary. Officer Martinez was 52 years old with 23 years of law enforcement experience, including 8 years working airport security, and he had learned to recognize the difference between genuine security threats and situations where gate agents let their authority go to their heads. His partner, Officer Kim, was younger and newer to airport duty, but he had enough experience to know that when passengers were openly filming a confrontation and posting it to social media in real time, the situation required careful handling rather than heavy-handed support for airline personnel. "What's the problem here?" Officer Martinez asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that comes from years of de-escalating tense situations, and Bob immediately stepped forward with the relieved expression of someone who believed that backup had arrived to validate his position and support his decision-making. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly," Bob said, his words tumbling over each other with nervous energy. "I have a passenger here who is attempting to board with what I believe is a fraudulent first-class ticket. She's refusing to provide additional verification of her payment method, and she's being increasingly belligerent about following standard security procedures that are designed to protect the airline and other passengers from fraudulent activity." Officer Martinez looked at Amelia, who was standing calmly beside the podium with her passport in one hand and her phone displaying her boarding pass in the other, and his first impression was of someone who seemed remarkably composed for a person who was supposedly committing fraud and being belligerent with airline staff. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said, addressing Amelia directly, "can you show me your identification and boarding pass?" Amelia handed him her passport and held up her phone, pointing to the boarding pass display that clearly showed her name, seat assignment, and first-class designation. "Officer, my name is Dr. Amelia Chen. I purchased this ticket legally with my corporate credit card, and the boarding pass scanned green when Mr. Hayes tested it, though he's now claiming there must be some kind of system error or fraud involved." Officer Kim stepped closer to examine the phone screen, and he could see that the boarding pass looked completely legitimate with all the proper airline formatting and security features that would be difficult to fake. "Did you actually scan her boarding pass?" he asked Bob, who nodded enthusiastically while pointing to his scanning device. "I did scan it, and it showed green, but that doesn't mean anything because these systems can be compromised by sophisticated fraud techniques," Bob insisted, though his explanation was becoming less confident as he realized that both officers seemed more interested in examining the evidence than in supporting his assumptions about Amelia's suspicious behavior. The growing crowd of passengers was becoming increasingly vocal about the delay, with several people shouting comments like, "Just let her board and we're going to miss our connection," and "This is ridiculous. The businessman who had spoken up earlier was now openly filming the confrontation with his phone, and Amelia could see at least a dozen other passengers doing the same thing, creating a record of Bob's behavior that would soon be viewed by millions of people around the world. "Ma'am, Officer Martinez said to Amelia, have you provided identification and cooperated with the airline's requests? I've provided my passport and boarding pass, and I've answered every question Mr. Hayes has asked." Amelia replied, "I've also suggested that he check the aircraft registration number, which would clarify my relationship with this airline and this particular aircraft, but he's declined to do so." Officer Kim glanced toward the windows overlooking the tarmac where the Boeing 787 was being prepared for departure, but like Bob, he was focused on the immediate dispute rather than on the broader context that Amelia was trying to provide. "What's significant about the aircraft registration?" he asked. "I think that's something Mr. Hayes should discover for himself," Amelia said with a slight smile that suggested she knew something that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. "But I'd encourage him to look at the registration number on the tail and the name painted under the cockpit window before he continues with his fraud investigation." Bob's face was growing redder with each passing minute, partly from embarrassment and partly from anger at what he perceived as Amelia's condescending attitude toward his professional expertise. "Officers, she's trying to confuse the issue with technical details that have nothing to do with whether or not she stole someone's credit card information to buy a ticket she obviously can't afford," he declared, his voice rising to a level that was attracting attention from passengers at other gates throughout the terminal. Amelia reached into her messenger bag and pulled out her personal cell phone, a simple black device that looked unremarkable compared to the expensive smartphones being used by the passengers around her to record the unfolding drama. Bob immediately became agitated when he saw the phone interpreting her action as an attempt to call someone who might help her avoid the consequences of what he was certain was fraudulent behavior. "Ma'am, you can't make phone calls to interfere with this security investigation," Bob announced, though Officer Martinez quickly corrected him with a shake of his head that indicated the gate agent was overstepping his authority in ways that were making the situation more complicated rather than less. "She has every right to make a phone call," Officer Martinez said, his tone suggesting that Bob should step back and let the actual law enforcement professionals handle the situation. "Ma'am, who are you calling?" "I'm calling Captain Jennifer Walsh, who is currently in the cockpit of the aircraft we're supposed to be boarding," Amelia said as she scrolled through her contacts and selected the captain's number. "She asked me to fly to Tokyo tonight to consult on a technical issue with the aircraft's engines, and she's probably wondering why the boarding process has been delayed for the past 20 minutes. Bob let out a harsh laugh that carried no humor, just the bitter sound of someone who was absolutely convinced that he was dealing with a pathological liar who thought she could talk her way out of trouble by making increasingly elaborate claims about her connections to airline personnel. "Right, you have the pilot's personal phone number," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And I suppose you're going to tell us next that you personally know the CEO of the airline and the President of the United States, too." "I don't know the President personally, though I have met him at a White House reception for small business owners," Amelia said as she held the phone to her ear and waited for Captain Walsh to answer. "But I do know Captain Walsh quite well because she's been flying aircraft equipped with engines that my company designed and manufactured, and we've worked together on several technical consultations over the past few years." The passengers in the boarding line were now openly laughing at Bob's increasingly frantic attempts to maintain control of a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond his ability to manage, and his colleague Sarah was watching from her adjacent gate with an expression of horrified fascination, as if she was witnessing a traffic accident in slow motion and couldn't look away despite knowing that the outcome was going to be devastating. "Hello, Jennifer," Amelia said when the call connected, and her voice carried the warm familiarity of someone who was talking to a professional colleague and longtime friend. "I'm at the gate, and Mr. Hayes here seems to think I'm attempting to board your flight with a stolen credit card and a fraudulent ticket. Would you mind coming up to explain the situation?" Bob could hear a woman's voice responding through the phone, though he couldn't make out the words, and his face went from red to pale as he began to realize that Amelia might actually be talking to someone who could verify her identity and her reasons for being on the flight. But his ego and his commitment to his original assessment of the situation prevented him from backing down, even as the evidence mounted that he had made a serious error in judgment. Anyone can call a random number and pretend to be talking to the pilot, Bob declared, though his voice was less certain than it had been a few minutes earlier. She could be talking to her accomplice, for all we know, someone who's helping her with this elaborate fraud scheme, and I'm not going to be fooled by theatrical phone calls that are designed to make me doubt my professional instincts about suspicious passenger behavior. Officer Kim looked skeptical about Bob's explanation, particularly since he could hear Captain Walsh's voice clearly through the phone, and she was speaking with the professional terminology and calm authority that was characteristic of experienced commercial pilots. "Ma'am," he said to Amelia, "is the captain actually coming up here?" She said, "She'll be here in about 2 minutes." Amelia replied, ending the call and putting her phone back in her bag. Captain Walsh has been wondering why the boarding process was delayed, and she's quite eager to resolve this situation so we can depart on time and avoid the cascading delays that affect international flights when they miss their departure slots. The mention of departure slots and cascading delays struck both officers as the kind of technical knowledge that would be unusual for someone who was attempting to commit boarding fraud, and Officer Martinez was beginning to suspect that Bob had made assumptions about Amelia based on her appearance, rather than on any actual evidence of wrongdoing. The door from the jetway burst open with the kind of authority that only comes from someone who is accustomed to being in command of complex machinery and the lives of hundreds of passengers, and Captain Jennifer Walsh strode into the gate area wearing the crisp Navy uniform and 4 gold stripes that immediately commanded respect from everyone present, including Bob Hayes, who had never seen a pilot respond so quickly to a passenger dispute. Captain Walsh was 44 years old with 20 years of commercial aviation experience, and she carried herself with the professional confidence of someone who had safely transported more than 2 million passengers across oceans and continents, while maintaining the kind of safety record that airlines use in their marketing materials. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was immaculate, and her expression suggested that she was not particularly happy about being called away from her pre-flight preparations to deal with what appeared to be an unnecessary confrontation at the boarding gate. "Dr. Chen," Captain Walsh said, walking directly to Amelia and extending her hand in greeting, "I apologize for the delay. We've completed all the pre-flight checks on the engine monitoring systems, and we're ready to begin the diagnostic procedures as soon as we reach cruising altitude." The entire gate area fell silent as passengers and airline personnel alike processed what they had just witnessed, a senior captain addressing the woman Bob had accused of fraud with the kind of professional respect reserved for technical consultants and VIP passengers, using terminology that clearly indicated they had worked together before and would be working together again during the flight to Tokyo. Bob's mouth opened and closed several times without any sound, emerging like a fish that had been pulled from water and was struggling to breathe in an environment it couldn't survive. His certainty about Amelia's fraudulent intentions crumbled in the face of Captain Walsh's obvious recognition and respect. But his ego prevented him from immediately admitting that he had been wrong about everything from the beginning. Captain Bob finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was just following standard security procedures to verify this passenger's ticket and payment method, because the circumstances of her booking seemed suspicious, and I wanted to protect the airline from potential fraud." Captain Walsh turned to look at Bob with the expression of someone who was trying to decide whether she was dealing with incompetence or malice, and her response carried the kind of controlled anger that comes from discovering that someone has been harassing a respected colleague for no legitimate reason. "Mr. Hayes, Dr. Chen is not just any passenger," Captain Walsh said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the gate area and ensuring that everyone present could hear her explanation of exactly who Amelia was and why Bob's behavior was so inappropriate. She is the founder and CEO of Chen Aerospace, the company that designed and manufactured the engines on the aircraft we're about to board, and she's flying to Tokyo tonight at my personal request to help us resolve a technical issue that could ground this plane for weeks if we don't address it properly. The crowd of passengers erupted in a mixture of gasps, laughter, and muttered comments like, "Oh my God," and "He really screwed up," and "This is going viral," as they realized they were witnessing the kind of public humiliation that becomes internet legend. The moment when someone's assumptions about other people based on appearance and prejudice collide with reality in the most spectacular way possible. Officer Martinez looked at Bob with a mixture of pity and professional disappointment because he had seen enough workplace bias incidents to recognize the pattern of behavior that leads to exactly this kind of situation. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I think we need to step back and reassess what's happening here because it appears that you may have made some incorrect assumptions about this passenger." But Bob's world was collapsing too quickly for him to process what was happening or to make rational decisions about how to minimize the damage he had caused to himself and to the airline he represented. His pride and his desperate need to be right were preventing him from accepting what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone else in the terminal. Captain Walsh gestured toward the windows overlooking the tarmac, where the Boeing 787 sat gleaming under the terminal lights, its sleek fuselage and distinctive wing shape representing the cutting edge of commercial aviation technology and fuel efficiency that had revolutionized long-haul travel in the 21st century. "Mr. Hayes," Captain Walsh said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who was explaining something that should have been obvious from the beginning, "I suggest you look at the aircraft registration number painted on the tail of that plane and then look at the name painted under the cockpit window, because I think you'll find some information that's relevant to this conversation." Bob turned reluctantly toward the window, his movements slow and hesitant because some part of his subconscious was already warning him that he was about to discover something that would make his behavior seem even more inappropriate than it already appeared to the growing crowd of passengers who were recording every moment of his humiliation for posterity and social media distribution. The registration number N-2847-AC was clearly visible on the tail of the aircraft, painted in large black letters that were required by federal aviation regulations and designed to be readable from significant distances. But it was the smaller text painted just below the cockpit windows that made Bob's knees weak and his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of his error in judgment. In elegant silver script clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look were the words "Phoenix Rising," Chen Aerospace, indicating not just the name of the aircraft but the company that owned it, leased it to the airline, and provided the technical support that kept it flying safely across the Pacific Ocean on a regular schedule that generated millions of dollars in revenue for the airline that employed Bob Hayes. Bob turned back from the window with his face completely drained of color, his hands trembling as the full implications of what he had done began to sink in, and his voice came out as barely a whisper when he finally managed to speak. You own the plane." "My company owns the plane," Amelia corrected gently, though her tone carried an edge that suggested her patience with Bob's behavior was approaching its limit. "Chen Aerospace leases this aircraft and 12 others like it to your airline. We provide the engines and technical support that keep them flying, and we employ more than 3,000 people whose jobs depend on maintaining the kind of professional relationships that you've been doing your best to destroy for the past 30 minutes. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of dozens of smartphones recording video, the soft electronic beeping of social media notifications, and the distant announcements from other gates throughout the terminal as the normal business of commercial aviation continued around them, oblivious to the fact that Bob Hayes' career was ending in real time at Gate 67A. Officer Martinez shook his head slowly, recognizing that he was witnessing the kind of spectacular workplace failure that would become a training case study for customer service representatives and diversity sensitivity programs throughout the airline industry. "Ma'am, I apologize on behalf of LAX security for this incident," he said to Amelia. "You're obviously free to board your flight, and I hope this delay hasn't caused any problems with your business schedule." "Thank you, Officer Martinez," Amelia replied, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the obvious stress and frustration of the past 30 minutes. "I appreciate your professionalism in handling this situation, and I understand that Mr. Hayes was attempting to follow what he believed were appropriate security procedures, even though his methods were somewhat misguided." Bob stood frozen beside his podium, watching his professional reputation dissolve like sugar in rainwater, as passengers continued to record video of his humiliation and post it to social media platforms that would ensure his behavior was preserved forever in the digital hall of fame reserved for people who let their prejudices overcome their common sense in the most public way possible. The revelation that Amelia Chen was not just a passenger but the owner of the aircraft created a ripple effect throughout Gate 67A that transformed what had begun as a simple boarding dispute into something much larger and more significant. A moment that captured the intersection of workplace bias, corporate power, and the dangerous assumptions people make when they judge others based on appearance rather than character or qualifications. Captain Walsh stepped forward to provide additional context that would make Bob's behavior seem even more inappropriate and professionally damaging. "Mr. Hayes, Dr. Chen didn't just design the engines on this aircraft," she explained, her voice carrying the respect and admiration that comes from working with someone whose technical expertise has repeatedly solved complex problems that stumped entire teams of experienced mechanics and engineers. She personally developed the fuel injection software that improved our fuel efficiency by 12%. She created the diagnostic systems that allow us to monitor engine performance in real time during flight. And she's flying to Tokyo tonight because our maintenance team in Seattle couldn't replicate a sensor issue that could ground this aircraft for 2 weeks and cost the airline approximately $4 million in lost revenue and passenger rebooking fees. The businesswoman standing behind them in line, a technology executive who had been growing increasingly impatient with the delay, suddenly spoke up with the kind of recognition that comes from reading industry publications and following developments in aerospace technology. "Wait, you're the Chen who developed the Phoenix engine series?" she said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and amazement. "I read about your company in Aviation Week last month. Your fuel efficiency improvements are revolutionizing long-haul flight economics." Amelia nodded politely, though she was clearly more interested in resolving the boarding situation than in discussing her technical achievements with fellow passengers. "We've been working on sustainable aviation technology for the past 8 years, she said. "The goal is to reduce emissions and operating costs while maintaining the safety and reliability standards that passengers expect from commercial aviation." Bob listened to this conversation with growing horror as he realized that he had not only misjudged a legitimate passenger, but had actively harassed one of the most important people in the commercial aviation industry, someone whose technical innovations and business relationships were crucial to his airline's profitability and operational success. His attempt to protect the airline from fraud had instead created a public relations disaster that would likely cost him his job and damage the airline's reputation with one of its most important business partners. The crowd of passengers was now openly discussing what they had witnessed, with several people mentioning that they were already posting videos to social media platforms and that the hashtag #GateGate was beginning to trend as word of the incident spread beyond the confines of LAX Terminal 6. The businessman who had been recording everything was already uploading his video to multiple platforms, ensuring that Bob's behavior would be preserved for posterity and viewed by millions of people around the world who would have strong opinions about workplace discrimination and customer service failures. "Dr. Chen Officer Martinez said, I think it's clear that there's been a significant misunderstanding here, and I want to ensure that you're able to board your flight without any further delays or complications. Is there anything else you need from us to resolve this situation?" Amelia looked at Bob, who was standing beside his podium with the expression of someone who was watching his entire professional life collapse in slow motion, and she felt a mixture of frustration and sympathy, because she recognized that his behavior, while inexcusable, probably stemmed from insecurity and fear rather than malicious intent. "I think Mr. Hayes and I need to have a brief conversation about what happened here tonight," she said. "But first I'd like to board the aircraft so Captain Walsh and I can begin the diagnostic procedures that are the reason I'm on this flight in the first place." Bob's supervisor, a stern-looking woman named Patricia Rodriguez, who had appeared during the commotion and had been watching the situation unfold with growing alarm, stepped forward to take control of what had become a crisis management situation that would require immediate damage control and probably legal consultation before the night was over. "Dr. Chen, on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize profusely for this incident," Patricia said, her voice carrying the professional calm of someone who was used to handling customer service disasters, but had never dealt with anything quite this spectacular or potentially damaging to the airline's business relationships. "Mr. Hayes will be removed from duty immediately pending a full investigation, and we will be reviewing our training procedures to ensure that nothing like this happens again." Patricia Rodriguez had been the terminal manager at LAX for 8 years, and she had handled every conceivable type of passenger dispute, airline crisis, and employee misconduct incident that could occur in a major international airport. But she had never faced a situation where a gate agent had harassed the owner of the aircraft they were supposed to be boarding, creating both a customer service disaster and a potential business relationship crisis that could cost the airline millions of dollars in lost contracts and negative publicity. Her first priority was damage control, which meant getting Amelia onto the aircraft as quickly as possible, while simultaneously beginning the process of investigating Bob's behavior and determining what disciplinary actions would be necessary to protect the airline from legal liability and further reputational damage. She pulled out her phone and immediately called the airline's crisis management team, explaining the situation in rapid clipped sentences that conveyed both the urgency of the problem and the potential scope of its impact on the airline's operations and business relationships. "We have a Code 5 passenger relations incident at Gate 67A, she said into her phone, using the airline's internal designation for customer service failures that involved VIP passengers or had the potential for significant negative publicity. Gate agent accused aircraft owner of fraud delayed boarding for 30 minutes, incident recorded by multiple passengers and already being posted to social media platforms." While Patricia coordinated with corporate headquarters, Captain Walsh was growing increasingly concerned about the impact of the delay on their departure schedule and their ability to maintain their Trans-Pacific flight plan, which had been carefully coordinated with air traffic control systems in multiple countries and required precise timing to avoid weather patterns and air traffic congestion that could add hours to their flight time. "Dr. Chen, we really need to begin boarding if we're going to maintain our departure slot," Captain Walsh said, checking her watch and calculating how much additional delay they could absorb before their carefully planned flight schedule would collapse into a cascade of missed connections, passenger rebooking fees, and operational complications that would affect dozens of other flights throughout the airline's international network. Amelia nodded and turned to address the crowd of passengers who had been waiting patiently while her confrontation with Bob played out in front of them like a live-action case study in workplace bias and customer service failure. "I apologize to everyone for the delay," she said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the gate area. "I hope we can board quickly now and get you to Tokyo on schedule." The response from the passengers was immediate and supportive, with several people applauding and others offering comments like, "You handled that perfectly," and "He got what he deserved." And I hope that video goes viral, reflecting their appreciation for how Amelia had maintained her composure and dignity throughout Bob's increasingly inappropriate behavior. Bob himself had been escorted to a private office by airport security, not because he was under arrest, but because Patricia needed to remove him from the gate area while she conducted a preliminary investigation into his behavior and consulted with the airline's legal department about potential liability issues and appropriate disciplinary responses. He sat in the small windowless room with his head in his hands, finally understanding the magnitude of his error and the career consequences he would face as a result of his inability to recognize his own biases and his refusal to listen when Amelia tried to explain who she was and why his assumptions were wrong. Sarah Chen, Bob's colleague, who had watched the entire incident from her adjacent gate, was already being interviewed by Patricia's assistant about Bob's recent behavior, his interactions with other passengers, and any previous incidents that might indicate a pattern of discriminatory conduct that the airline had failed to address through appropriate training or disciplinary action. Sarah's account would become part of the official record that would determine not only Bob's employment future, but also whether the airline had adequate policies and procedures in place to prevent similar incidents from occurring with other employees. The boarding process finally began 45 minutes behind schedule, with passengers filing onto the aircraft while discussing what they had witnessed and sharing their videos with friends and family members who would soon be sharing them with their own social networks, creating a viral spiral of attention that would make Bob Hayes one of the most recognizable faces of workplace discrimination in the age of social media documentation and instant global communication. Once aboard the Phoenix Rising, Amelia settled into seat 2A, the first-class accommodation that Bob Hayes had been so convinced she couldn't afford, and immediately began setting up her laptop and diagnostic equipment for the technical consultation that had brought her to Los Angeles in the first place. The irony was not lost on her that Bob's attempt to prevent her from boarding had delayed the very work that could save his airline millions of dollars in maintenance costs and operational disruptions. Captain Walsh joined her in the first-class cabin once the aircraft had reached cruising altitude over the Pacific Ocean, and together they began monitoring the engine sensor data that had been generating the intermittent warnings that concerned the maintenance teams in Seattle and Tokyo. Amelia connected her laptop to the aircraft's diagnostic port, a specialized interface that she had designed specifically for real-time monitoring of engine performance during flight operations. The sensor readings look normal now, Captain Walsh observed, watching the data stream across Amelia's computer screen as the Phoenix Rising engines performed flawlessly at 37,000 feet above the ocean. But the intermittent warnings were definitely occurring during our last 3 flights on this route, always during the cruise phase when we're operating at maximum efficiency settings. Amelia studied the data patterns, comparing them with the baseline performance specifications she had established during the engine development process, and within an hour, she had identified the source of the problem, a software calibration error in the new sensor array that was interpreting normal engine variations as potential maintenance issues and triggering false alarms that would have required expensive and unnecessary engine replacements. "It's a firmware bug in the latest sensor update," she explained to Captain Walsh, showing her the diagnostic code that had been causing the false readings. "The sensors are working perfectly, but the interpretation algorithm was too sensitive to normal temperature fluctuations during cruise operation. I can patch this remotely and push the fix to your entire fleet tonight." The solution took Amelia less than 2 hours to develop and implement, representing millions of dollars in saved maintenance costs and hundreds of hours of prevented aircraft downtime that would have affected thousands of passengers and dozens of flight schedules. It was exactly the kind of technical problem-solving that had built her reputation in the aerospace industry and established Chen Aerospace as one of the most innovative and reliable partners in commercial aviation. As she worked, Amelia reflected on the evening's events and the broader implications of what had happened at Gate 67A. Bob's behavior was not unique or unusual. It was representative of the unconscious biases and assumptions that affected countless interactions in airports' offices and business settings around the world, where people's qualifications and capabilities were judged based on appearance, gender, age, or ethnicity, rather than on their actual credentials and achievements. She thought about her father, who had faced similar skepticism and discrimination throughout his career as one of the few Asian American engineers in the aerospace industry during the 1980s and 1990s, and who had taught her that the best response to prejudice was excellence, combined with patience, demonstrating through consistent performance that assumptions based on appearance were not just wrong, but counterproductive for everyone involved. By the time the Phoenix Rising began its descent into Tokyo's Narita Airport, Amelia had not only solved the engine sensor problem, but had also made a decision about how to handle the situation with Bob Hayes and the broader issues of workplace bias that his behavior represented. She would not pursue legal action against him personally, but she would work with the airline to implement comprehensive training programs that would help prevent similar incidents and create a more inclusive environment for both passengers and employees. While Amelia was solving technical problems at 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, the video of her confrontation with Bob Hayes was spreading across social media platforms with the viral intensity that only comes from content that perfectly captures broader social tensions and workplace dynamics that millions of people have experienced in their own lives. The hashtag #GateGate was trending on multiple platforms, with the original video being shared, commented on, and discussed by everyone from aviation industry professionals to civil rights activists to customer service experts who saw Bob's behavior as a textbook example of how unconscious bias can lead to spectacular professional failures in full view of paying customers and social media audiences. Major news outlets were picking up the story, interviewing aviation industry experts about discrimination in the airline industry and workplace bias in customer service settings, while business publications were focusing on the broader implications for corporate training programs and customer relations policies that needed to address the reality of social media documentation and instant global communication of customer service failures. Bob Hayes, meanwhile, was sitting in his Torrance condo, watching his professional reputation being dissected and analyzed by strangers on the internet, reading comment after comment that ranged from sympathetic observations about workplace stress to harsh criticisms of his behavior and demands that he face serious consequences for what many people saw as clear-cut discrimination against a qualified professional who happened not to look like his preconceived notion of what a wealthy passenger should look like. The airline's corporate communications team was working overtime to manage the crisis, issuing statements that apologized for the incident while emphasizing their commitment to diversity and inclusion. But the damage to their reputation was significant and would require months of careful public relations work to repair. Stock analysts were already speculating about the potential impact on the airline's business relationship with Chen Aerospace and whether the incident would affect their ability to lease additional aircraft or negotiate favorable maintenance contracts. Aviation Week published a detailed analysis of the incident, interviewing industry experts about the broader patterns of discrimination that affect women and minorities in aerospace and aviation, while highlighting Amelia's achievements and her company's innovations in sustainable aviation technology. The article positioned her as a role model for perseverance in the face of workplace bias, while also noting that her calm and professional response to Bob's behavior had probably prevented the situation from escalating into something even more damaging for everyone involved. Social media users were creating memes and jokes about Bob's behavior, with many people sharing their own stories of being misjudged based on their appearance in professional settings, while others focused on the broader lessons about making assumptions about people's qualifications or capabilities based on superficial characteristics rather than taking the time to gather actual information about their background and credentials. The incident was also being discussed in diversity and inclusion training sessions at companies across multiple industries, as human resources professionals recognized that Bob's behavior represented exactly the kind of unconscious bias that could create legal liability and reputational damage for any organization whose employees made similar assumptions about customers, clients, or business partners based on appearance rather than evidence. 3 weeks after the incident at LAX, Bob Hayes sat across from a mediator in a downtown Los Angeles conference room, facing the most difficult conversation of his professional life as he prepared to take responsibility for his behavior and participate in what Amelia Chen had proposed as an alternative to a costly and time-consuming lawsuit that would have destroyed him financially while doing little to address the broader issues his conduct had revealed. The mediation was Amelia's idea, a restorative justice approach that she had learned about through her work with diversity organizations in the aerospace industry, and it represented her belief that people could change and grow when they were given the opportunity to understand the impact of their behavior and take meaningful steps toward making amends for the harm they had caused. Bob looked older than his 47 years, his face drawn and tired from 3 weeks of unemployment, public humiliation, and the collapse of his marriage, as Jennifer had finally decided that his pattern of defensive behavior and inability to acknowledge his mistakes made their relationship unsustainable. He had spent those weeks in therapy working with a counselor who specialized in helping people recognize and address their unconscious biases, and he was beginning to understand how his insecurities and fears had influenced his interactions with passengers who didn't fit his narrow expectations about who belonged in first class. Mr. Hayes, the mediator, began. Dr. Chen has proposed this process as an alternative to legal action, but it requires your full participation and honest acknowledgement of what happened that night at LAX. Are you prepared to take responsibility for your behavior and work toward meaningful change? Bob nodded, his voice barely audible as he spoke. I know I was wrong, he said, looking directly at Amelia for the first time since they had sat down together. I know I let my assumptions and my fears guide my behavior instead of following proper procedures, and I know I caused harm not just to Dr. Chen, but to everyone who witnessed what I did, and to the airline that trusted me to represent them professionally. Amelia studied Bob's face, looking for signs of genuine remorse, rather than the kind of performative apology that people sometimes offered when they were caught behaving badly in public, and she saw something that gave her hope. Real shame, and a dawning understanding of how his behavior had reflected broader patterns of discrimination that affected countless people in similar situations every day. Bob, she said, using his first name to signal that she was willing to treat him as a human being rather than just as someone who had wronged her. I want you to understand that what happened between us wasn't really about airline policies or security procedures. It was about assumptions you made based on my appearance. Assumptions that led you to treat me as if I were less credible, less trustworthy, and less deserving of basic respect than the passengers who looked more like your idea of what a first-class passenger should look like. Bob winced at her words, but he didn't argue or try to justify his behavior, because 3 weeks of therapy and self-reflection had helped him recognize that his actions had been driven by exactly the kind of unconscious bias that Amelia was describing. Biases that he had never acknowledged or addressed because they had been masked by his genuine commitment to airline security and his professional pride in following procedures. I want to make this right, Bob said, his voice growing stronger as he realized that Amelia was giving him an opportunity to contribute to solutions rather than just accepting punishment for his mistakes. I want to do whatever I can to help prevent this from happening to other people, and I want to learn how to be better than I was that night at the gate. 6 months after the LAX incident, the Chen-Hayes protocol had been implemented at 47 airports across North America, representing the most comprehensive reform of passenger relations training in the history of commercial aviation, and establishing new standards for how airline personnel should interact with passengers, regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status. The protocol was named for both Amelia and Bob, reflecting their collaboration in developing training materials that used their confrontation as a case study, while also incorporating Bob's perspective as someone who had experienced firsthand how unconscious bias could lead to professional disaster and personal humiliation. Bob had become an unlikely but effective advocate for workplace diversity training, sharing his story with airline employees who could relate to the pressures and insecurities that had influenced his behavior, while also learning from his mistakes. The training program included role-playing exercises that helped employees recognize their own biases and assumptions, decision-making frameworks that emphasized evidence over appearance in customer service interactions, and clear protocols for handling passenger disputes that prevented individual employees from making unilateral decisions based on personal judgments rather than established procedures. Chen Aerospace had partnered with the airline to fund a scholarship program that provided financial support for underrepresented students pursuing careers in aviation and aerospace, with Bob serving as one of the program mentors who helped scholarship recipients navigate the challenges and opportunities in an industry that was slowly becoming more diverse and inclusive but still had significant work to do in addressing historical patterns of discrimination and exclusion. Bob's community service had evolved into a paid position as a diversity and inclusion trainer work that allowed him to rebuild his career while also contributing to positive change in an industry that he had served for 18 years before his moment of spectacular professional failure. His marriage had not survived the crisis, but his relationship with his teenage daughter had actually improved, as she saw him taking responsibility for his mistakes and working to become a better person, rather than defending behavior that he knew was wrong. The airline industry trade publications were reporting significant improvements in customer satisfaction scores and reductions in passenger complaints related to discriminatory treatment, while social media sentiment analysis showed that the airlines implementing the Chen-Hayes protocol were receiving more positive coverage and fewer viral negative incidents involving passenger relations failures. Amelia had expanded her company's diversity initiatives beyond the scholarship program, creating internship opportunities for students from underrepresented backgrounds and establishing mentorship programs that connected experienced aerospace professionals with young people who were interested in engineering careers but might not have had access to the networks and guidance that could help them succeed in competitive technical fields. The broader aviation industry had also taken notice of the changes, with aircraft manufacturers, airlines, and airport authorities collaborating on industry-wide standards for inclusive customer service and workplace diversity that went beyond basic legal compliance to create genuinely welcoming environments for passengers and employees from all backgrounds and demographics. The incident that had begun with Bob's assumptions about who belonged in first class had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how unconscious bias affected every aspect of the aviation industry, from hiring practices to customer service to business partnerships, and the reforms that emerged from that examination were making commercial aviation more fair, more inclusive, and more respectful of the diversity that characterized both the workforce and the passenger population in the 21st century. 1 year after their confrontation at LAX Gate 67. Amelia Chen and Bob Hayes found themselves standing together on a stage at the Los Angeles Convention Center, addressing an audience of 1,200 airline industry professionals who had gathered for the annual Aviation Diversity and Inclusion Summit, an event that had been inspired by their story and had become the premier forum for discussing workplace bias and inclusive practices in commercial aviation. Bob was nervous as he approached the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to deliver the most important speech of his life to an audience that included many of the industry leaders whose opinions would determine whether his transformation from gate agent to diversity advocate would be accepted as genuine or dismissed as opportunistic performance designed to rehabilitate his damaged reputation. "My name is Bob Hayes." He began, his voice gaining strength as he made eye contact with the audience. "And 18 months ago, I was a gate agent at LAX, who made the biggest mistake of my professional life when I allowed my fears and assumptions to override my training and my humanity, leading me to harass and humiliate a passenger who turned out to be one of the most important innovators in our industry." He paused, looking over at Amelia, who was sitting in the front row, with an encouraging smile that reflected the genuine friendship they had developed through months of working together on training programs and speaking engagements that had taken them to airports and conferences across the country. I could spend the next 20 minutes explaining the pressures I was under, the insecurities that influenced my behavior, and the fear of losing my job that made me desperate to prove my value to my employer by finding problems where none existed. Bob continued. But the truth is simpler and more painful than any explanation I could offer. I judged Dr. Chen based on her appearance. Rather than her credentials, I treated her as if she were less deserving of respect than other passengers, and I nearly prevented her from boarding an aircraft that she literally owned, because my prejudices were stronger than my professionalism. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word as Bob described his journey from that moment of professional failure to his current role as someone who helped other airline employees recognize and address their own unconscious biases before they could cause similar harm to passengers and damage to their employers. The most important thing I've learned over the past year. Bob said, his voice growing emotional as he approached the climax of his speech, is that change is possible, but only when we're willing to look honestly at our behavior and take responsibility for the harm we've caused, not just to the people we've directly affected, but to the broader community of travelers who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of how they look or what assumptions we might make about their backgrounds or qualifications. When Bob finished speaking, the applause was thunderous and sustained, reflecting not just appreciation for his honesty and vulnerability, but recognition that his transformation represented hope for the broader changes that the aviation industry needed to make to become truly inclusive and welcoming for everyone. Amelia took the podium next, and her speech focused on the positive changes that had emerged from their confrontation. The scholarship program that had provided opportunities for 47 students from underrepresented backgrounds. The training protocols that had reduced passenger discrimination incidents by 63% at participating airports, and the broader cultural shift that was making aviation more diverse and inclusive for both employees and passengers. Bob and I have learned that true accountability isn't just about admitting mistakes, Amelia said in closing. It's about working together to ensure that those mistakes become the foundation for positive change that benefits everyone. We can't undo what happened that night at LAX, but we can make sure that our confrontation becomes a catalyst for the kind of transformation that makes our industry better for the next generation of aviation professionals and the millions of passengers who trust us to get them safely to their destinations. After their speeches, Bob and Amelia stood together for a photo that would appear in aviation trade publications around the world. Two people whose lives had intersected in a moment of conflict, but who had chosen to transform that conflict into an opportunity for growth, understanding, and meaningful change that would affect thousands of people throughout the aviation industry for years to come. The incident became a catalyst for aviation industry reform. 12 major airlines adopted the Chen-Hayes Protocol for passenger relations, eliminating discriminatory profiling practices that had persisted for decades. The comprehensive training program reduced bias-related customer complaints by 70% and became the industry standard for inclusive customer service. Bob Hayes became one of the most effective bias trainers in the industry, using his story to help others recognize their prejudices before acting on them. His transformation was so complete that he was eventually hired by the airline he had embarrassed, leading their newly created Office of Passenger Relations and Diversity. His relationship with his daughter flourished as she saw him taking genuine responsibility for growth. Dr. Amelia Chen's aerospace innovations continued revolutionizing aviation, but she considered the cultural change her greatest achievement. The scholarship program she established had grown to support over 200 students annually, fundamentally changing the demographic composition of the aerospace workforce. True power, she often said in speeches, is not proving you belong somewhere, it's opening doors so others can belong there too. If this story of transformation and second chances moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, redemption, and the power of choosing understanding over revenge. Share your thoughts in the comments about how we can build bridges across difference in our own communities. Together, we can create the change we want to see in the world.